Today, the oceans cover more than 70% of our planet, teeming with life. Whales sing in the deep, coral reefs glow with color, and billions of fish move in endless waves. The sea feels eternal, unchanging, a place of abundance and mystery. But if you had looked at Earth 250 million years ago, you would have seen something terrifyingly different. The oceans were on the brink of death. Nearly 90% of all marine life vanished. Entire ecosystems collapsed, leaving behind a silent, empty world. This was not just an extinction, it was almost the end of life itself. If you're listening to this while falling asleep, that's exactly why I create these videos. So maybe consider subscribing and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how this channel connects people all over the world, like someone in Tokyo drifting off at night while someone else in New York listens over breakfast. Before the ocean fell silent, the world looked unimaginably different from what we know today. The land masses were not arranged in familiar continents, but were instead clustered into a supercontinent that stretched across much of the Earth's surface. Vast deserts dominated the interior, while the coastlines opened into immense oceans that seemed eternal. From the surface, these seas glimmered under a blazing sun, but beneath the waves thrived a hidden kingdom of life, complex and vibrant, far more alien than anything we encounter today. To step into these waters would have been to enter a place of both wonder and terror, where survival was determined by constant motion, sharp teeth, and intricate balances that had evolved over millions of years. The oceans were home to coral-like reef systems that pulsed with activity. These reefs weren't made by the same corals we know today, but by ancient builders, sponges, algae, and early calcifying organisms that created fortresses of stone under the waves. They formed labyrinths where small creatures darted between the crevices, seeking shelter from predators. Brightly colored fish analogues, armored with thick plates, shimmered in the sunlight that filtered through the clear, warm waters. In the deeper layers, shadows drifted silently, giant predators whose sleek shapes spoke of ancient mastery of the seas. Among the most impressive rulers of this world were massive reptilian swimmers, descendants of creatures that had ventured back into the ocean. They dominated with jaws full of sharp, interlocking teeth designed to crush bone and shell alike. Some glided gracefully, their long bodies moving like living torpedoes, while others lurked in ambush, waiting to strike with terrifying speed. The seas were crowded with ammonites, relatives of squid and octopus, spiraled shells gleaming like jewels as they drifted in schools, their tentacles snapping at smaller prey. Trilobites, which had once been among the most successful creatures on Earth, were still present in reduced numbers, scuttling along the sea floor like armored insects. Every level of the ocean, from surface to abyss, carried its own cast of characters, each performing roles in a delicate play that had endured for countless ages. The surface shimmered with plankton, the invisible engine of life. These microscopic drifters filled the waters, capturing sunlight and turning it into energy that sustained everything above them. Without them, the food chains would have collapsed in an instant. Schools of jawless fish, odd and eel-like, swam with writhing movements, feeding on tiny organisms that clouded the waters. Sharks, already ancient by this time, hunted with precision, their bodies perfected through millions of years of refinement. The oceans were a stage of constant pursuit, where predator and prey chased each other in endless cycles. Yet for all its brutality, it was also a place of extraordinary beauty, with ecosystems balanced like a fragile glass sculpture. Life near the coasts was especially rich. Mangrove-like forests lined certain areas where plants were beginning to push into brackish water zones, blurring the line between land and sea. Here, strange amphibious creatures ventured in and out, carrying the story of evolution on their bodies. Early plants grew along the shore, their roots stabilizing sediments and shaping habitats where young marine life could thrive. The coasts acted as nurseries, places where the next generation of fish and shelled animals found safety until they were strong enough to move into open waters. This interplay between land and sea created a dynamic environment where energy constantly flowed in multiple directions. Beneath the surface, in the gloom of deeper waters, conditions were harsher but equally alive. Gigantic cephalopods stretched their tentacles across the dark, their eyes glowing faintly as they hunted prey that strayed too close. Primitive crabs and arthropods scuttled across the sediment, scavenging what the upper layers discarded. Some fish had evolved to withstand crushing pressures, their bodies distorted into strange forms that would appear grotesque to modern eyes. Yet in their own way, they were masterpieces of survival, filling niches where few others could endure. Even the abyss was far from empty. Life had found a way to cling to every corner of the sea. Above this alien kingdom, the climate was harsh and unstable. The supercontinent meant that vast stretches of land were barren and dry, lacking rainfall because moisture rarely reached so far inland. Temperatures swung dramatically, scorching in some regions and freezing in others, and the oceans played a critical role in regulating these extremes. The seas absorbed heat, moved currents across the globe, and acted as the beating heart of the planet's climate system. In a way, they were both protector and provider, ensuring that life had a chance to thrive even when conditions on land were unforgiving. Without the oceans, Earth would have been little more than a desolate rock, incapable of sustaining the incredible variety of organisms that had developed. It is easy to imagine these oceans as eternal, but they were already under subtle pressures. Volcanic chains released gases that altered the chemical balance of the atmosphere. The slow drift of tectonic plates reshaped coastlines, opening new seaways and closing others, disrupting established patterns of circulation. Yet for countless creatures, life seemed stable, almost invincible. Day after day they hunted, spawned, fed, and died, unaware that they were living in a world balanced on a knife's edge. From the perspective of those ancient animals, nothing seemed to hint at the catastrophe approaching. The sea was vast, food was plentiful, and the cycles of existence carried on as they had for millions of years. Imagine standing on the shore of this ancient earth, looking out at a horizon that stretched forever, the waters shimmering with the motion of countless living beings. The air would be filled with the sounds of waves and the occasional crash of a predator breaking the surface with its kill. The beach itself might be littered with shells larger than a human head, the remains of ammonites washed up in the tide. Strange creatures would be visible even from the shallows, armored fish with bizarre jaw structures, or eel-like swimmers darting in chaotic schools. Everything about this world would feel both familiar and utterly foreign, as though nature had painted with a completely different palette. For millions of years, this system thrived. It was not static, but resilient, capable of adapting to shifts in temperature, chemistry, and geography. Life had been tested before, through ice ages, through shifts in oxygen levels, through smaller extinction events that had thinned populations, but never fully erased them. The oceans always recovered, rebounding with new forms of innovation, new predators and prey to fill the gaps. This resilience gave the impression of permanence, as though nothing could ever truly challenge the supremacy of the seas. But beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would strain this resilience beyond its breaking point. The balance that allowed life to flourish was more fragile than it appeared. The very conditions that had made these oceans so productive were also what made them vulnerable. Oxygen levels, temperature ranges, and chemical stability all existed within narrow bands. If those bands shifted too far, the chain would begin to unravel quickly. And while individual creatures could adapt or migrate, entire ecosystems could not always keep pace with changes that came suddenly or violently. This was the world before collapse, a world of staggering richness, filled with predators and prey, light and shadow, beauty and brutality. A world where oceans seemed eternal, feeding and sheltering life on scales that defied comprehension. Yet history would prove that even the mightiest systems can falter. These oceans, once so vibrant and alive, stood on the edge of a transformation so profound that it would nearly erase everything within them. It was a reminder written into the very stone of the earth. Nothing, no matter how vast, is immune to change. And in the story that followed, the oceans themselves would become a graveyard, silent and empty, leaving behind a world scarred almost beyond recognition. Beneath the shimmering surface of the prehistoric seas, danger was already quietly unfolding. It did not arrive as an explosion, a sudden storm, or a cataclysm that could be seen with the naked eye. Instead, it crept into the oceans in silence, carried by currents, dissolved in water, invisible but deadly. For countless creatures, life appeared unchanged. Schools of fish still swam in synchronized flashes of silver. Ammonites drifted gracefully in spirals of shell, and monstrous predators patrolled the deep. Yet in the chemistry of the water itself, the first signs of disaster were beginning to accumulate, threatening to suffocate entire ecosystems before their inhabitants even realized anything was wrong. The oceans had always been the lifeblood of the planet, but they were delicate in ways life rarely appreciated. Oxygen dissolved in water allowed gills to extract the energy of breath, fueling the endless cycles of pursuit and survival. But the levels of oxygen were not fixed, and as volcanic eruptions rumbled across the supercontinent, vast plumes of gas seeped into the atmosphere and into the seas. Carbon dioxide poured forth in unimaginable quantities, saturating the air, dissolving into the waves, and slowly shifting the balance of the oceans. What had once been stable, fertile water became heavier with acid, its pH tilting toward danger, imperceptible at first, but devastating in its consequences. Creatures continued to live as if nothing had changed. Small plankton captured sunlight and multiplied, but their shells, once sturdy and efficient, began to dissolve more easily in the acidified waters. Reef builders struggled, their structures growing weaker, more fragile, unable to hold the weight of bustling ecosystems that depended on their stone-like fortresses. Fish swam through waters that carried less and less oxygen, unaware that their gills were straining harder with every breath. It was like living in a room where the air was being slowly drained, not enough to notice immediately, but enough that each passing generation carried the silent burden of survival in an environment growing less hospitable with every tide. The signs of collapse were subtle but visible to those who would have stood on the shore. Dead zones began to spread along the coastlines, places where currents failed to refresh the water, leaving it stagnant and suffocating. Carcasses of fish and invertebrates floated to the surface, washed onto beaches where they piled in silent testaments to a shift too massive for individuals to resist. In the deep ocean, layers of water stratified, warm above, suffocating below. Entire realms of once thriving ecosystems fell into silence, their residents gone, their niches left empty. For predators, the change meant hunger. With smaller organisms dying in vast numbers, the food chains that had always been reliable began to unravel. Sharks prowled the seas but found fewer schools to strike. Reptilian hunters lunged through the water, jaws snapping into emptiness. Some species, unable to find enough prey, dwindled in number, their bodies growing thinner, their reproductive cycles failing. The balance of power shifted not through battles or hunts, but through the quiet starvation of apex predators whose fates were tied to the invisible chemistry of the seas. Volcanism continued to feed this crisis. Beneath the surface of the earth, vast eruptions split the land apart, pouring lava across the supercontinent, releasing immense volumes of greenhouse gases. These eruptions did not stop for days or months. They continued for hundreds of thousands of years, relentlessly pumping carbon dioxide and methane into the air. The greenhouse effect warmed the atmosphere, and the oceans absorbed much of this heat. Warmer water held less oxygen, amplifying the suffocation already spreading through the seas. It was a vicious cycle, a feedback loop where each factor worsened the next, and the silent killers beneath the waves grew stronger with every century. to the ammonites drifting in their spiraled shells, to the armored fish cruising the reefs, these changes were imperceptible. They lived, bred, and hunted as they always had, guided by instincts honed over millions of years, yet slowly, their world was betraying them. Eggs hatched less successfully. Juvenile survival rates plummeted. Populations shrank. Each death might have seemed meaningless in isolation, but together they formed the outline of a mass extinction that had already begun. The reefs, once vibrant metropolises of life, became graveyards. Coral-like structures bleached and collapsed, their delicate frameworks unable to withstand the acidity of the water. The countless species that relied on these reefs for food and shelter vanished with them. Schools that once numbered in the thousands dwindled to mere handfuls. Predators that had always stalked these crowded waters now swam through emptiness, shadows gliding through silence. The very architecture of marine ecosystems was dismantled brick by brick as the unseen chemical killers advanced. At the same time, hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas, began to seep into the seas. As oxygen levels dropped, bacteria that thrived in anoxic conditions multiplied, producing poisonous clouds that drifted upward from the depths. These invisible veils of death suffocated fish, poisoned shellfish, and further eroded the fragile line between survival and collapse. Some scientists today describe this stage of the oceans as strangled, caught between heat, acid, and poison, unable to breathe, unable to sustain the vast networks of life that had defined them for millions of years. For life on land, the ocean's suffering was equally catastrophic. The seas had always been a buffer, regulating temperatures, capturing carbon, providing moisture that fueled rains. But as they destabilized, climates grew harsher, deserts expanded, and rainfall patterns shifted. Plants that had only just begun to colonize land struggled against new extremes, their roots starved by erratic weather. The earth itself was changing in ways that amplified the suffocation below, and there was nowhere to hide. The terrifying truth was that the killers were not monsters with claws and teeth, not predators hunting from the shadows, but gases, molecules, and heat. They spread invisibly, slowly, without sound or warning. They carried no intent and no malice, yet they were more destructive than any predator the oceans had ever known. They did not hunt individuals, they hunted entire ecosystems, entire oceans, entire possibilities of life. Still, life clung on in pockets. Some species managed to adapt to lower oxygen, evolving behaviors that allowed them to survive in shallow, warmer waters where oxygen was slightly more abundant. Others burrowed into sediments, hiding from the toxic layers above. Microorganisms thrived in conditions that killed everything else, becoming both beneficiaries and accelerants of the crisis. In these desperate refuges, the seeds of survival endured, even as the majority of marine life fell silent. From the perspective of time, these changes happened with terrifying speed. In the blink of geological history, oceans that had sustained billions of lives for millions of years became deadly. For creatures alive at the time, it was slow enough to feel like the world was always this way. But for the Earth itself, it was a moment, a collapse that unfolded in the span of a few million years, devastatingly quick in the rhythms of evolution. The silent killers beneath the waves were relentless. Oxygen vanished, acidity rose, temperatures climbed, poisons spread. The seas, once a sanctuary of abundance, became hostile, suffocating their inhabitants in invisible nets. This was not a war fought with weapons or claws. It was chemistry against biology, a slow-motion catastrophe that erased life, not with violence, but with inevitability. What began as imperceptible changes would soon cascade into the greatest collapse the oceans had ever endured, setting the stage for one of the darkest chapters in the history of life on Earth. The collapse of marine life did not happen in a single dramatic instant. It unfolded as a slow unraveling, an invisible chain reaction that pulled apart the very fabric of the food web. For millions of years, the oceans had been a place of endless abundance. They had weathered storms, shifted climates, and adapted to new predators. Yet when the chemistry of the seas tipped past its fragile balance, every link in the chain began to snap, one by one, until the ocean was transformed from a place of thriving life into a graveyard of silence. It began with the smallest creatures, the ones that no one could see, but that sustained everything else. Plankton populations, the foundation of the food chain, faltered as acidic waters dissolved their shells and weakened their structures. The microscopic organisms that captured sunlight and transformed it into energy could no longer reproduce with the same efficiency. Fewer plankton meant less food for the tiny filter feeders that had relied on them. The base of the pyramid crumbled and the collapse rippled upward, starving those who lived above. Small fish and invertebrates were the next to suffer. Once countless in number, darting in synchronized schools or clinging to reefs, their populations plummeted. Many species could not adapt to the reduced oxygen or the acidified conditions, and breeding grounds failed. Eggs dissolved before hatching. Juveniles died in shallow waters that had once been protective. Shellfish, mollusks, and crustaceans, whose exoskeletons depended on calcium carbonate, were eaten away by the water itself. Shells grew thin and brittle, unable to shield the creatures within. Those that survived carried deformities, weaker bodies that could not withstand predators or competition. With their prey vanishing, predators starved. Sharks, which had prowled the seas with unmatched precision, swam through empty waters, their sleek bodies wasting away. Ancient reptilian hunters, massive and powerful, lunged with gaping jaws only to snap into emptiness. These apex predators had thrived because the oceans had always provided. Now they were betrayed by the collapse of abundance. Hunger weakened them, reproduction faltered, and their numbers dwindled until even the greatest hunters disappeared from the waters they once ruled. The reefs, once dazzling centers of activity, became ruins. Their intricate structures crumbled as reef-building organisms succumbed to the chemical shifts. Without reefs, countless species lost their homes and feeding grounds. The bustling metropolises of marine life turned into barren wastelands. Where once hundreds of species coexisted in tight spaces, now there were only desolate stretches of rock and sand. The disappearance of the reefs was not only the loss of beauty, but the loss of diversity itself, a collapse that reached into every corner of the ocean. Even the open waters, vast and seemingly endless, could not escape. Entire schools of fish vanished, leaving behind a void that no predator could fill. Ammonites, with their elegant spiral shells, once floated in abundance, their numbers so vast they were like drifting galaxies. Now, they too dwindled, their shells dissolving, their populations falling until only scattered remnants remained. The ocean floor, which had been alive with trilobites, crustaceans, and scavengers, grew eerily still, littered with the remains of creatures that had no one left to recycle them. The collapse was not merely a loss of individual species, but the breakdown of interconnected systems. Each creature depended on another, and when one link broke, the rest followed. Starving predators no longer controlled prey populations. Prey species that managed to survive could not sustain themselves without the foundation of plankton. Even microorganisms shifted in dominance, with toxic bacteria flourishing in low-oxygen waters, creating zones where nothing else could live. The web was not just unraveling, it was being rewoven into something alien and hostile. On the surface, this catastrophe may have seemed like the work of invisible forces, but its evidence was plain to see. Beaches were strewn with the corpses of fish, shells, and invertebrates. Waters, once alive with darting shapes, grew murky and still. The silence was haunting. For millions of years, the ocean had been filled with sound, the clicking of crustaceans, the rushing of schools, the distant roars of predators breaking the surface. Now, in many places, there was nothing but the crash of waves against an empty shore. The scale of the collapse is difficult to comprehend. Nearly 90% of all marine species were wiped out. 90 out of every 100 forms of life that swam, crawled, or drifted in the ocean disappeared forever. It was a level of destruction that dwarfed anything the Earth had seen before. A mass extinction so complete that it reshaped the very identity of the seas. What had once been the greatest reservoir of biodiversity on the planet was reduced to scattered survivors clinging to existence in isolated refuges. This loss was not uniform. Some creatures managed to endure where others failed. A handful of fish adapted to shallow, oxygen-rich waters. Certain resilient invertebrates managed to withstand the acidity, their shells stronger or their bodies less dependent on calcium. Microorganisms thrived in places too hostile for larger life, turning dead zones into realms of bacterial domination. These survivors were exceptions, not the rule, and their endurance highlighted the scale of the devastation. The collapse was not selective. It spared almost nothing. The disappearance of marine life also reshaped the planet itself. The oceans had always regulated carbon, drawing it from the atmosphere through the bodies of countless organisms. As life collapsed, that cycle faltered. Dead matter sank to the ocean floor, but without thriving ecosystems to recycle it, carbon lingered, altering the climate further. The seas, once a stabilizing force, became another source of instability. The collapse of life fed into the collapse of climate, each reinforcing the other in a downward spiral. For the survivors, the ocean was no longer a realm of abundance, but of desperation. Small pockets of life endured, eking out existence in shallow coasts or in isolated refuges where oxygen remained. But even in these sanctuaries, diversity was gone. What had once been a symphony of forms and colors was reduced to a monotonous struggle, a handful of creatures carrying the burden of survival. The grandeur of the prehistoric ocean had become a shadow of itself, a reminder of what had been lost. From a human perspective, looking back through time, the collapse seems inevitable once it began. The chain reaction, once started, could not be stopped. Each failure led to another. Each disappearance weakened the system further. It was a demonstration of how fragile abundance truly is, how quickly the richness of life can be stripped away when the conditions that sustain it falter. The oceans had seemed eternal, yet they unraveled in what was, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. The collapse of marine life marked not just the end of countless species, but the end of an era. Entire lineages, once dominant, vanished without descendants. Predators that had ruled for millions of years were erased. Reefs that had sheltered endless generations were gone. The oceans themselves were transformed, not merely diminished, but remade into something unrecognizable. It was a loss so profound that it altered the course of evolution, setting the stage for a new world that would emerge only after the silence. And in that silence lay the most chilling truth. The collapse did not need violence or spectacle. It did not roar or strike with claws. It crept, invisible, through chemistry and imbalance, until the seas themselves turned hostile. Life, which had seemed invincible in its abundance, proved fragile, and the greatest kingdom on Earth crumbled into emptiness. The forgotten ocean was not destroyed by monsters or asteroids, but by the slow suffocation of its own lifeblood. The collapse of marine life was not merely an event in history, it was the near erasure of life itself. The oceans were not destroyed in isolation. Their collapse was bound to forces on land, forces that reshaped the entire planet in ways both visible and invisible. At the heart of the devastation were the vast volcanic eruptions that tore through the supercontinent, spewing fire and ash into the air, carving rivers of lava that stretched for hundreds of miles. These eruptions were not short-lived disasters. They persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, an almost ceaseless churning of the Earth's mantle, pouring out unimaginable volumes of molten rock and gas. The land itself became an engine of destruction, and its fury spilled into the seas that had once been sanctuaries of life. The volcanic fields covered entire regions, burying landscapes beneath thick, black basalt. The atmosphere filled with gases, carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide. Each of these chemicals played a role in destabilizing the delicate balance of the planet. Carbon dioxide thickened the greenhouse blanket, trapping heat and driving global temperatures upward. Methane, even more potent, magnified the warming, sending feedback loops spiraling out of control. Sulfur dioxide filled the skies with haze, reflecting sunlight away at times, cooling briefly but then breaking down to create acid rain that poured across both land and sea. Every eruption left scars, and together they rewrote the climate in ways life had never experienced before. Rain that fell on the land carried poisons into rivers, and from rivers into oceans. Sediments washed into the sea, clouding waters that had once been clear and vibrant. Acidified rainfall seeped into the soil, killing plants, eroding early forests, stripping the land of the stability that vegetation had begun to bring. Without roots to anchor them, vast amounts of earth washed into the ocean, smothering reefs and shallow ecosystems in heavy blankets of silt. The land was not only feeding gases into the atmosphere, but also choking the seas with debris, burying the very habitats marine life had depended upon. The warming caused by greenhouse gases was relentless. Temperatures rose across the globe, and the oceans absorbed the majority of that heat. Warmer waters spread like a fever, pushing species beyond their thresholds. Fish accustomed to cooler currents could not migrate far enough to find relief. Coral-like organisms that had built entire ecosystems bleached and died under the stress. Oxygen levels dropped further as warm waters failed to hold the gas. The land's eruptions had created conditions that turned the seas into a suffocating trap. At the same time, the breakup of the supercontinent began to reshape coastlines and currents. As tectonic forces pulled land apart, new basins formed and old seaways closed. Currents that had once delivered oxygen and nutrients shifted or stagnated, leaving some areas of the ocean starved of circulation. The deep waters, cut off from renewal, became stagnant zones, accumulating layers of toxic compounds. Hydrogen sulfide, produced by bacteria thriving in anoxic conditions, spread like an invisible tide. When it reached the surface, it poisoned marine life outright, leaving entire stretches of coastline littered with death. The land had shifted, and the seas bore the consequences. Volcanic gases did more than heat the atmosphere and acidify the rain. They altered the chemistry of the air itself, reducing oxygen and thickening the sky with a greenhouse haze. This, in turn, weakened the boundary between land and sea. Plants that had only just begun to spread across Earth's surface withered under the stress. Their decline reduced the oxygen they contributed to the atmosphere, amplifying the suffocation of both air and water. The Earth was suffocating in every direction, above and below, and the link between the land and the ocean tightened that noose further with each passing century. On land, the eruptions created barren wastelands where nothing could survive. Forests burned, soils sterilized, landscapes transformed into endless expanses of rock and ash. These scars bled into the oceans with every rainfall, every river carrying toxins downstream. Metals like mercury and lead, pulled from deep within the earth by volcanic fire, entered the water in high concentrations, poisoning food chains already on the brink of collapse. Fish absorbed these toxins, predators consumed the fish, and the poisons accumulated until bodies could no longer function. The ocean was not merely starving, it was being poisoned in layers from the inside out. Life that had once thrived in shallow waters suffered the most. Coastal areas, where biodiversity had always concentrated, became lethal. Oxygen was stripped from the water, replaced with suffocating toxins. Waves of death moved outward from shorelines, devastating reefs, nurseries, and estuaries. The seas grew quieter, emptier, until even the open waters showed the marks of collapse. The land's fury had poisoned its partner, and the ocean, which had seemed eternal, now mirrored the destruction that spread across continents. For the animals that survived longest, the signs of struggle were etched into their bodies. Fossils reveal abnormalities, deformed shells, stunted growth, skeletal distortions that tell the story of stress carried in every generation. Species that had once flourished for millions of years now bore the marks of decline in their very bones. These creatures were not simply losing battles with predators or competition. They were losing a war against the environment itself, a war they could not hope to win. And yet, the land did not relent. For hundreds of thousands of years, volcanic activity continued, spewing fire and choking the skies. The earth itself seemed determined to press against the boundaries of what life could endure. Every eruption, every shift of tectonic plates, every plume of gas pushed the seas further into crisis. The interconnection between land and ocean meant that nothing was isolated. The earth was a single system, and when one part faltered, the rest collapsed with it. As the catastrophe deepened, the ocean became a mirror of the land's chaos. Where the land burned, the seas suffocated. Where rivers carried ash and poison, the waters turned murky and dead. Where tectonic forces tore at the crust, the currents shifted and failed. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring to erase the life it had nurtured for so long. The oceans had once been places of refuge, absorbing blows from space, buffering against climate, sheltering the vulnerable when land was too hostile. But now, the oceans themselves were vulnerable, undermined by the very forces that had built them. To imagine this world is to picture a planet where every boundary collapsed. The land was aflame, the seas suffocating, the air heavy with gases. On the coasts, carcasses piled in silence. In the deep, predators swam through darkness with no prey to pursue. On land, forests shrank, deserts grew, rivers choked with ash and poison. The link between land and sea, once a partnership, had become a chain of destruction that pulled both into ruin. The collapse of marine life was not only a story of the ocean, it was a story of the land turning against the sea, of the Earth's own processes overwhelming the balance that life had built. Volcanic fury, shifting continents, acid rains, greenhouse heat, all of it converged into a single catastrophe that nearly erased the ocean's heartbeat. The forgotten ocean was the product of this betrayal, a place where land and sea conspired, unintentionally but relentlessly, to silence nearly all of life. And yet, even in this ruin, life clung on. A handful of species survived, adapting to poisoned waters and barren landscapes. Their survival would one day rebuild the oceans. But in the moment, the world was defined by emptiness, by silence, by a partnership of land and sea that had turned lethal. The ocean, once the great refuge of Earth, had become its greatest casualty, and the land, once nourished by those seas, had become their executioner. It was a collapse that proved how tightly the fate of the planet was bound together, and how quickly one realm's fury could erase another's abundance. The silence of the dying seas was made more haunting by the sheer number of creatures that would never return. Entire lineages, once flourishing in the oceans, were erased, leaving behind only traces in stone. To imagine their world is to imagine forms so strange and wondrous that they would seem like monsters to us now, yet they were perfectly adapted to their time. Their disappearance was not just the loss of individuals, but the end of evolutionary stories that had been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. Each vanished creature was the conclusion of a tale written in the language of survival, and the oceans became a library of unfinished books. Among the most iconic of the lost were the ammonites, distant relatives of today's squid and octopus. They drifted in the seas in vast numbers, their spiraled shells coiling like galaxies, each chamber filled with gas that allowed them to float at will. Some were no larger than a coin, while others grew to several feet across, intricate patterns etched across their shells. They were hunters and scavengers, moving with tentacles that reached from the mouth of their shell to snatch prey from the currents. For millions of years, ammonites had thrived through crises and extinctions, resilient in the face of Earth's shifting climates. Yet the catastrophe of this forgotten ocean overwhelmed even them. Acidified waters dissolved their shells, reproduction faltered, and their once glorious reign ended in silence. Their fossils today are among the most common reminders of that ancient loss. But they are echoes, not survivors. Reef builders were also among the vanished. The organisms that had constructed immense underwater fortresses, creating habitats for countless species, collapsed under the dual pressures of warming seas and chemical imbalance. Their skeletons, once sturdy, became fragile, dissolving before they could accumulate into protective structures. The reefs crumbled, not in dramatic explosions, but through slow decay, leaving empty seascapes where vibrant ecosystems had stood. Along with the reefs, disappeared the communities they sustained. The small armored fish that darted between crevices, the crustaceans that scavenged in their shadows, the predators that hunted the shoals drawn to those rich environments. With the builders gone, the cities of the sea fell into ruin, never to be rebuilt in the same form again. Jawless fish, ancient survivors from even earlier eras, were another casualty. They were primitive, eel-like creatures with mouths adapted for sucking or filtering rather than biting. Their bodies were simple compared to later fish, lacking jaws and paired fins, yet they had endured for hundreds of millions of years. They glided through the waters in large schools, filling ecological roles that later fish would inherit. But when oxygen levels plummeted and the seas grew toxic, they could not adapt quickly enough. Their decline marked the end of some of the earliest vertebrate experiments, an evolutionary path cut short by forces far beyond their control. Many shelled creatures vanished as well. Brachiopods, which resembled clams but belonged to a different lineage, had once carpeted the ocean floor in staggering abundance. They anchored themselves to surfaces with stalks, filtering nutrients from the water with feathery arms. For ages, they had been among the most successful life forms in the sea, yet during this catastrophe, their numbers dwindled drastically. Though some lineages would survive in diminished forms, the vast empires they had once built across the sea floor were shattered forever. Alongside them, trilobites, those iconic, segmented arthropods that had scuttled across the seabed for over 250 million years, faced their final curtain. They had survived multiple extinctions, adapting to new niches again and again, but this time their resilience was not enough. The last trilobites disappeared in the waves of devastation, leaving behind only their fossilized remains as reminders of their long success. Giant predators were not spared either. The great reptilian hunters that had patrolled the seas found themselves with nothing left to eat. Their sleek, torpedo-like bodies, their massive jaws filled with conical teeth, once made them rulers of the water. Some reached lengths that dwarfed most modern sharks, slicing through schools of fish and tearing into ammonites. They had been the undisputed apex predators of their age, but when prey vanished, so did they. Even their power and size offered no protection against the collapse of the food web. The seas became empty stages, and these hunters disappeared, their evolutionary paths erased. Microscopic life also suffered losses that are difficult to measure, but devastating in scale. The plankton that formed the foundation of the food chain were decimated. Some species vanished entirely, unable to survive in acidic, low-oxygen waters. Others endured but in drastically reduced numbers, weakening the chains above them. This microscopic extinction was perhaps the most consequential of all, for it toppled the very base of marine ecosystems. It was a reminder that extinction does not always roar in the form of monstrous beasts. Sometimes it whispers in the absence of the smallest lives, and the entire system collapses from the bottom up. One of the strangest casualties were the reef-dwelling crinoids, relatives of starfish, which resembled plants more than animals. They anchored themselves to the sea floor with long stalks, waving feathery arms into the water to capture drifting food. In healthy oceans, they formed gardens of living stalks, swaying like fields of wheat in the currents. During the crisis, their populations fell into ruin. Unable to adapt to the toxic shifts, they withered, and their graceful motions vanished from the seas. The extinction of such organisms stripped the oceans not only of life, but of the strange beauty that had defined them. The losses extended to creatures that modern humans might never recognize at all, bizarre experiments of evolution that had thrived in specific niches. Some had armored bodies that looked like living tanks. Others had jaws shaped like saws, or bodies built to burrow deep into sediment. Each had its role in balancing the ocean's ecosystems, and each was erased when the environment turned against them. They left behind no descendants, no modern analogs, only questions written in the fossil record. The oceans, once bursting with innovation and diversity, became simplified, emptied of much of their creative potential. What makes this roll call of vanished creatures so profound is not simply their strangeness or beauty, but the realization that they were once dominant. They were not rare or marginal. They were the backbone of ecosystems that had lasted for millions of years. Their disappearance was not the fading of fragile experiments, but the erasure of pillars. The forgotten ocean did not just lose its ornaments. It lost its structure, its foundation, its very identity. Even in their absence, their stories echo through the rocks. Fossils of ammonites spiral through layers of stone. Silent witnesses to abundance turn to emptiness. Trilobites, preserved in intricate detail, remind us of a lineage that survived longer than almost any other, only to meet its end here. Brachiopods lie in fractured shells, a carpet of bones marking their downfall. Each fossil is a record of loss, a frozen moment in the unraveling of a world. The creatures that vanished forever teach us a truth both sobering and humbling. Dominance offers no immunity, abundance no guarantee. The mightiest hunters, the most numerous filter feeders, the most enduring survivors all fell together when the ocean's balance broke. The forgotten ocean erased them, not with one blow, but with the slow turning of conditions they could not resist. Their absence reshaped the future, clearing the stage for other forms of life to rise, but leaving behind a silence that could never be filled. The seas we know today, filled with whales, dolphins, coral reefs, and schools of fish, exist only because of that loss. But the memory of what vanished lingers, written into the stones of the earth, a testament to the fragility of life and the merciless power of change. The forgotten ocean swallowed its inhabitants whole, and in doing so, it rewrote the possibilities of evolution forever. The vanished creatures will never return, but their ghosts remain, whispering from the fossil record of a world almost erased. In the shadow of devastation, when nearly everything in the ocean had succumbed to suffocation and collapse, some creatures endured. Their survival was not the result of strength or dominance, but of chance, resilience, and adaptability. While most of the marine world was silenced, small pockets of life managed to hold on, clinging to existence in conditions that seemed impossible. These survivors became the bridge between the world that had ended and the world yet to come. They carried the thread of life forward through one of Earth's darkest chapters, proving that even in the most hostile of times, survival was possible. The survivors were scattered and few. Entire ecosystems had been dismantled, but in shallow coastal areas where oxygen levels were higher, some species found refuge. Small fish, less dependent on deep currents and capable of living in waters with fluctuating oxygen, managed to persist. Their lives were precarious, but their smaller bodies required less energy, and they reproduced quickly enough to maintain fragile populations. These fish were not the giants or the predators that had once ruled, but their ability to endure gave them a future when larger species vanished. Shellfish also had their survivors. Though acidified waters dissolved the shells of many, certain mollusks were more resistant, either through thicker shells or through biological mechanisms that allowed them to tolerate lower pH. Clams and bivalves in particular managed to hold on in isolated pockets, anchored in sediments that protected them from the worst of the changing waters. They fed slowly and modestly, filtering what little nourishment remained in the shallows. Though their numbers were reduced to a fraction of their former abundance, they endured where many others perished. Microorganisms, as always, proved the most resilient. While complex life faltered, bacteria and archaea thrived in the new, toxic conditions. In the deep, where oxygen had disappeared, sulfur-loving bacteria expanded, feeding on the chemical chaos. These microbes not only survived, but proliferated, reshaping the ocean's chemistry in their favor. Though hostile to most marine life, they demonstrated the flexibility of life at its smallest scales. Microorganisms do not require stability, they thrive in extremes, and so they became the dominant life forms during the collapse. In them, the continuity of life was most secure, and they would form the basis for ecosystems when conditions finally began to improve. Some invertebrates also endured, though just barely. Sea urchins, with their hard spines and ability to graze on algae, managed to persist in scattered refuges. Starfish and related echinoderms found ways to survive as well, their simple but efficient body structures allowing them to withstand changing conditions. These creatures, less specialized than the reef builders or ammonites, were flexible enough to adapt, finding sustenance in places where others could not. Their survival ensured that when the oceans eventually recovered, they would remain a part of the new balance. The survivors were not defined by dominance, but by modesty. They were not the largest or most powerful, but the ones capable of living on less, adapting quickly, and reproducing in unstable environments. Large predators vanished because they needed abundance. Survivors endured because they could persist in scarcity. The forgotten ocean favored humility over grandeur, and those that endured were the ones that asked the least from their collapsing world. In some places, burrowing creatures gained an advantage. Worms, crustaceans, and mollusks that could bury themselves in sediments found shelter from toxic waters above. Hidden beneath the sea floor, they accessed microenvironments that provided slightly more stable conditions. These buried sanctuaries were imperfect, still vulnerable to poisons and oxygen loss, but they offered enough stability to allow generations to continue. Burrowers carried on quietly, invisible beneath the devastation, but critical to the survival of marine ecosystems when recovery came. What is striking about these survivors is how unremarkable they would have seemed in their own time. They were not the apex predators that drew awe, not the towering reef builders that defined ecosystems. They were background players, overlooked in the presence of giants. Yet when catastrophe came, their smallness, their adaptability, their ability to live in marginal spaces became their strength. Evolution had not prepared them for disaster directly, but their versatility gave them the tools to endure. This endurance reshaped the future. The survivors carried genetic lineages that would diversify when conditions improved. Small fish that weathered the crisis would give rise to new forms of vertebrates. Mollusks and clams would flourish again in later ages, expanding into niches left empty by extinction. Microorganisms, always present, would continue to form the invisible backbone of ecosystems. The forgotten ocean did not end life completely. It trimmed it to the barest threads, and from those threads, a new world would grow. It is sobering to imagine what the oceans must have looked like at the peak of collapse. Where once there had been vibrant reefs, there were barren wastelands of rock and silt. Where once predators had ruled, there were only empty waters. But scattered among the emptiness, small lives continued. Tiny fish flickering in shallow pools, clams filtering from muddy bottoms, bacteria churning in toxic darkness. It was life reduced to its simplest forms, life stripped of grandeur, yet life nonetheless. Fossil evidence confirms these survivors. Certain bivalves and brachiopods reappear after the extinction, diminished in diversity, but alive. Trace fossils reveal burrows in sediments, marks left by creatures that continued to dig and feed despite the hostile waters. Chemical signatures in rocks show the dominance of microbial life, the fingerprints of bacteria thriving where larger organisms had perished. The evidence paints a picture of survival not through triumph but through persistence, of life clinging on in corners until the storm passed. The survivors remind us that mass extinctions are not absolute erasures. They are bottlenecks, narrowing the path of evolution, but never fully closing it. What emerges afterward is always different, shaped by the handful that made it through. The forgotten ocean was no different. Its survivors were not symbols of victory, but of endurance. They did not flourish in the moment. They endured long enough for conditions to change, long enough to carry the story of life forward. For millions of years after the collapse, the oceans remained impoverished compared to what they had been. Biodiversity was low, ecosystems simple, predators few. But even in this stripped-down world, the survivors multiplied, slowly, patiently. They filled the emptiness step by step, transforming desolation into possibility. Their survival meant that the ocean's silence was not permanent, that one day it would be broken again by the sounds of life returning. Their story carries an enduring lesson. Survival does not always belong to the strongest. It belongs to the most adaptable, the most patient, the ones capable of enduring change without collapsing. In the forgotten ocean, survival meant being able to breathe when oxygen was scarce, to withstand when waters were acidic, to feed when prey was gone. Those who could not adapt vanished, no matter how mighty they had been. Those who could persist, however modestly, became the architects of the future. The forgotten ocean nearly erased life, but not entirely. In the shallow waters, in the sediments, in the microbial haze, survivors carried the fragile thread of existence. Their endurance turned extinction into transformation. The silence they endured became the foundation of renewal. Though the seas had lost nearly everything, the survivors ensured that life's story did not end there. They kept the flame alive in the darkest depths of time, a faint light that would one day ignite a new age of oceans. The evidence for this forgotten extinction does not come from stories passed down or from written records. It is written instead in stone, in the language of geology and fossils, a language that requires patience and precision to read. The oceans that nearly died left behind signatures that can still be found today, locked in layers of rock, in chemical traces, and in the petrified remains of creatures that once swam in waters, now long vanished. To reconstruct what happened, scientists pieced together fragments from across the world, each discovery adding a new brushstroke to the portrait of catastrophe. One of the clearest clues lies in the fossil record. Before the extinction, layers of sediment are filled with abundant remains. Ammonites in spiraled shells, brachiopods carpeting the sea floor, trilobites in intricate detail, corals and reef builders layered together in complex assemblages. These fossils appear in staggering numbers, evidence of oceans rich with life. Then suddenly, in the layers that mark the crisis, they vanish. The abundance turns into absence. Species that had been common for millions of years are gone, their fossils replaced with emptiness or the rare survivors that endured. This sharp boundary, where richness turns into scarcity, is the signature of mass extinction. It is as if the ocean's story was torn apart mid-sentence, leaving only fragments of what came before. The rocks themselves tell another part of the tale. In the chemical composition of ancient sediments, scientists find signals of the changes that suffocated life. Carbon isotopes shift abruptly, showing spikes that reveal massive releases of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and ocean. These spikes align with volcanic activity, confirming that eruptions were flooding the planet with greenhouse gases. Oxygen isotopes reveal warming oceans, temperatures that climb to levels far beyond what marine organisms could withstand. In some places, sulfur isotopes reveal the presence of toxic gases, signs that hydrogen sulfide was spreading into the water and even into the atmosphere. These chemical fingerprints show that the oceans were poisoned from within and from without, a system collapsing under chemical assault. Sedimentary layers also show changes in color and composition that speak to suffocation. Black shales, rich in organic matter, appear in abundance during the extinction interval. These rocks form when dead organisms accumulate in oxygen-depleted waters, where decay slows and organic carbon is preserved. Their presence shows that vast areas of the ocean floor were starved of oxygen, turning into dead zones where nothing could survive except bacteria that thrived without oxygen. These black layers stretch across continents, recording in stone the silence that filled the seas. They are the graves of entire ecosystems, compressed into rock that still whispers of suffocation millions of years later. Fossils themselves show the stress of the catastrophe. Shells that survived bear signs of deformities, pitted surfaces, irregular growth lines, evidence of acidified waters dissolving their structures. Some shells are thinner than they should be, fragile compared to those in earlier layers. Growth rings in corals and other organisms show disruptions, years when growth slowed or ceased entirely, evidence of environmental stress pressing against life. Even microfossils, the tiny remains of plankton, show sudden collapses in diversity and abundance, their once complex communities reduced to a handful of resilient forms. These signs are not subtle. They are scars etched into the very bodies of creatures that lived through the collapse. Beyond fossils, the very arrangement of rocks reveals the upheaval. In regions once covered by shallow seas, geologists find abrupt changes in sedimentation. Thick volcanic deposits overlay marine sediments, showing how eruptions reshaped landscapes and coastlines. River deposits suddenly increase, evidence of eroded soils washing into the sea after vegetation on land collapsed. Layers of ash mark the sky's fury, volcanic material carried across continents and settling into the oceans. These physical records show how intimately land and sea were connected, and how the Earth's own processes left a record of devastation across both realms. Scientists also look to microscopic clues buried in rocks. Tiny crystals of minerals capture chemical conditions at the time they formed. Iron minerals, for example, can reveal whether waters were oxygen-rich or oxygen-poor. In extinction layers, these minerals often show conditions of anoxia, reinforcing the story told by fossils and shales. Other minerals capture the presence of sulfur, confirming the spread of toxic gases. These minute signals, invisible without microscopes and careful analysis, build a picture of oceans that were not only losing life but transforming chemically into hostile environments. Even more haunting are the gaps in the fossil record. In places where layers should hold diverse fossils, there are only voids. Entire groups disappear without descendants. This absence is itself evidence, showing how thoroughly life was erased. Unlike minor extinctions, where species decline but recover, the forgotten ocean left behind deserts of stone where diversity should have been. It is as though a vast library had been burned, leaving only a few scattered pages to hint at what was lost. The global reach of the evidence makes the catastrophe undeniable. Across different continents, in rocks of the same age, the same patterns emerge. Sudden loss of fossils, black shales rich in organic matter, chemical shifts that signal suffocation and poisoning. Whether in Europe, Asia, North America, or Africa, the story is the same. The extinction was not a local disaster, not confined to one ocean or one region. It was a global collapse, a synchronized failure of ecosystems across the planet. The rocks of the world all carry the same signature, proving that this was not a coincidence, but a singular catastrophe that reshaped Earth forever. What makes these records especially powerful is how they link together. Fossils show the loss of life. Rocks show the chemical changes that drove it. Volcanic layers show the source of gases. Together, they form a chain of evidence that explains how oceans once full of abundance became nearly empty. It is a story not of speculation, but of data, of countless scientists reading the language of the Earth to uncover events that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. Each discovery adds weight to the conclusion. The oceans nearly died, and the evidence of their suffering is preserved in stone. The process of uncovering this evidence is itself a testament to persistence. Paleontologists crawl through cliffs, chiseling fossils from stone. Geologists drill cores from deep beneath the sea floor, pulling up cylinders of layered sediments that reveal the history of oceans long vanished. Chemists analyze isotopes in laboratories, teasing out signals measured in fractions of percentages to reconstruct the chemistry of ancient waters. The story of the forgotten ocean is not written in one place but across the globe, pieced together through decades of work, collaboration, and patience. The evidence buried in stone does more than confirm that extinction happened. It allows us to see how fragile life truly is, how quickly conditions can turn hostile, and how even the mightiest ecosystems can collapse. Fossils of vanished creatures remind us of diversity lost forever. Black shales remind us of suffocation spreading through waters. Chemical signatures remind us of the poisons that choke the seas. The rocks are silent, but their silence speaks of a world that nearly ended. When we look at these records, we are peering into the aftermath of catastrophe. The fossils we see are not just remains. They are survivors' tombstones, marking the end of lineages that stretched back hundreds of millions of years. The rocks we analyze are not just sediments. They are archives of collapse, capturing the moment when the oceans themselves turned against life. The evidence buried in stone is the voice of the forgotten ocean, still speaking to us across vast spans of time, warning us of the fragility of abundance and the permanence of loss. The extinction of the forgotten ocean was not only a catastrophe of the distant past, it was also a lesson written into the earth, one that reveals how fragile life can be and how easily abundance can turn into emptiness. When we look back at that event, we see more than the disappearance of ammonites, trilobites, and reefs. We see a mirror of the delicate systems that sustain us today, systems that appear vast and unshakable, but that depend on balances just as fragile as those that once governed the ancient seas. The forgotten lessons of that collapse speak not only of survival, but of warning. The first lesson is that stability is an illusion. For millions of years before the extinction, the oceans seemed eternal. They had rebounded from smaller crises, adapted to changing climates, and nurtured incredible diversity. To the creatures living then, the seas must have seemed invincible. Yet in a geological instant, they failed. Conditions shifted slightly, temperatures rose, oxygen fell, waters turned acidic, and those small changes cascaded into devastation. What looked permanent was only temporary, a balance maintained by chance and circumstance. The lesson is clear. No matter how enduring ecosystems appear, they can unravel quickly if the forces that sustain them are disrupted. The second lesson is that abundance does not guarantee survival. The oceans were overflowing with life, yet that richness made them vulnerable. When the base of the food chain collapsed, the higher levels collapsed even faster. The predators that had seemed invincible, the giants that ruled the seas, vanished because their strength relied on fragile abundance. Survival belonged not to the powerful, but to the adaptable, the modest, the ones capable of living with less. This inversion of expectation warns us that dominance and success are not shields against collapse. They are often the most fragile positions when systems begin to fail. The third lesson lies in the role of invisible forces. The killers of the forgotten ocean were not monsters with claws or teeth. They were gases, heat, chemistry, shifts in circulation, forces that could not be seen, but that altered the world completely. These same forces are at work today. Carbon dioxide is invisible, yet it warms the atmosphere and acidifies the seas. Oxygen levels shift silently, unnoticed until ecosystems fail. Poisons seep quietly, their effects revealed only in the silence of vanished species. The extinction teaches us that we must not underestimate the unseen, for it is often the invisible changes that do the greatest harm. There is also the lesson of connection. The oceans did not die alone. Their collapse was tied to the land. to volcanoes, to shifting continents, to the atmosphere. The Earth is a system, every part linked to every other. When one realm falters, the others follow. The forgotten ocean shows us how interconnected life truly is, how rivers carry poisons into seas, how gases from land reshape the chemistry of the deep, how the survival of forests and reefs are bound together. Today, our actions echo this same interconnection. What is burned on land warms the seas. What is poured into rivers suffocates reefs. The lesson is one of unity and of vulnerability shared across all realms. The extinction also reveals the cost of ignoring gradual change. Catastrophe did not strike in a single day. It crept forward slowly, with each year only slightly worse than the one before. To the creatures alive then, it may have felt like normal variation, small stresses that could be endured. Yet across millennia, those stresses compounded until they became fatal. The forgotten ocean teaches us that waiting for collapse to become obvious is too late. By the time the silence arrives, the systems that sustained life have already failed. The lesson is to recognize danger in its subtle beginnings, not only in its dramatic ends. Another lesson comes from the survivors. The ones who endured were not the strongest, but the most adaptable. They survived by hiding in sediments, by tolerating low oxygen, by reproducing quickly, by living modestly. Their lesson is that resilience is found in flexibility, in diversity, in the ability to adjust when conditions change. The forgotten ocean shows us that if ecosystems are to endure, they must not rely on single pillars of abundance, but must spread their strength across many forms of life. Diversity is protection, and when it is lost, survival becomes fragile. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is the permanence of loss. The creatures that vanished will never return. The ammonites, the trilobites, the reefs built by ancient builders, the predators that ruled the seas, once gone, they were gone forever. Evolution moved forward, filling the emptiness with new forms, but the old forms were erased. The forgotten ocean warns us that extinction is final. There is no second chance, no revival once a lineage disappears. Life continues, but it continues along a different path, one that may be less rich, less diverse, less capable of wonder. These lessons are not only about the past, they speak directly to the present. Today, our oceans are warming, carbon dioxide is rising, acidification is spreading. Dead zones expand each year, places where oxygen vanishes and life suffocates. Coral reefs, the modern builders of marine cities, bleach and collapse under stress. Fish populations dwindle, predators starve, and ecosystems unravel in ways that echo the forgotten ocean. The parallels are too strong to ignore. The same forces that once nearly erased marine life are stirring again, driven not by volcanoes, but by human activity. The forgotten ocean is a warning written across time, reminding us that history can repeat if its lessons are not heeded. It is tempting to believe that we are different, that with our knowledge and technology, we are immune to the fate of ancient seas. But the forgotten ocean reminds us of humility. Life is fragile, and no amount of dominance can shield it from collapse if its foundations are destroyed. The oceans today seem vast and invincible, but so too did the oceans of the past. The warning is not for them, but for us. Abundance can vanish, stability can shatter, silence can return. Yet there is also hope in the lessons. The survivors of the forgotten ocean show that even in the darkest times, life can endure. Adaptation is possible. Recovery is possible. The oceans today are full of wonders that would never have existed if some small creatures had not survived the catastrophe. That survival gave rise to new forms, new beauty, new stories in the history of life. The lesson is that while collapse is real, renewal is also possible, if life is given the chance to endure. The forgotten ocean was nearly the end, but it was not the end. From its silence emerged new possibilities, new ecosystems, new futures. The lessons it leaves are not only warnings, but reminders that what we do now matters. We live in a time when the same forces threaten to stir again. We can choose to learn from the scars of the past, to see in them a mirror of our present, and to act before silence falls once more. The Forgotten Ocean was a near erasure, a story of devastation written in stone. Its lessons remain, waiting for us to listen, to remember, and to ensure that history does not repeat. In the aftermath of devastation, the oceans stood nearly silent. The vibrant ecosystems that had once filled every corner of the seas were gone, replaced by emptiness and decay. The collapse had erased nearly 90% of marine species, leaving behind only scattered survivors. For millions of years, the oceans remained impoverished, stripped of diversity and complexity. Yet slowly, quietly, the process of recovery began. It was not dramatic or immediate. It was measured in millions of years, in the patience of evolution, in the persistence of life to fill voids whenever opportunity arose. The world rebuilt itself not through sudden triumphs, but through countless small victories, each one laying the foundation for a new ocean. The first stages of recovery were dominated by simplicity. The survivors, small fish, hardy mollusks, microorganisms, burrowers, expanded into the emptiness. With so much competition gone, they found space to reproduce and spread. Where once they had been marginal players overshadowed by giants, they now became central. Shallow waters that had been barren slowly filled with bivalves, clams anchoring themselves into sediments, filtering food from the water. Worms and crustaceans burrowed into the sea floor, recycling nutrients and stabilizing sediments. These humble creatures created the groundwork for ecosystems, performing the basic functions of life that would one day support complexity again. Microorganisms flourished in particular, with few larger organisms to keep them in check. Bacteria and plankton multiplied, filling the seas with invisible energy. These tiny creatures once again captured sunlight, fueling food chains from the bottom up. Their abundance stabilized the chemistry of the oceans, slowly drawing carbon from the atmosphere and helping to reestablish balance. In the silence of the Forgotten Ocean, microscopic life was the quiet architect of renewal, restoring the foundation that all larger life would depend upon. Over time, new forms of life began to emerge. Evolution works most quickly when opportunities are vast, and after a mass extinction, opportunities are everywhere. With so many ecological niches left empty, survivors diversified to fill them. Small fish developed new body forms, new feeding strategies, new defenses against predators that no longer existed. Mollusks branched into new varieties, some burrowing deeper, others adapting to rocky coasts, still others developing stronger shells against the lingering acidity. Each adaptation was a response to absence, a way to claim spaces that had been abandoned by extinction. As the oceans stabilized chemically, reefs began to return. They were not the same as before. The ancient builders that had once dominated were gone, replaced by new groups capable of constructing ecosystems from calcium carbonate. These early reefs were smaller and less complex, but they provided shelter, food, and breeding grounds. In their structures, fish and invertebrates found safety, and the cycle of life began to build toward complexity again. The reef's rebirth marked a turning point, showing that even after near-total collapse, the ocean could invent new architectures of abundance. Predators, too, eventually returned. As prey species expanded, opportunities arose for hunters. Early sharks diversified into new forms, their sleek bodies refined to pursue the fish that now dominated. Reptilian predators reappeared in different guises, adapted from survivors that had clung to existence during the extinction. They were smaller at first, less dominant, but their presence reintroduced the balance of predator and prey that had once defined the oceans. Slowly, the food chains lengthened, and complexity returned to the seas. The timeline of recovery was immense. For tens of millions of years after the extinction, biodiversity remained low compared to what had existed before. It took nearly 100 million years for ecosystems to approach their former richness. To us, that span is unimaginable, longer than the entire history of humanity by far. Yet in geological time, it was the patient rhythm of Earth, the slow rebuilding of life from ruin. Each generation added a fraction more diversity, each adaptation a small step toward the rebirth of abundance. This process of renewal was not uniform. Some regions recovered more quickly, while others remained barren for longer. Shallow coastal seas, where conditions stabilized first, became hotspots of rebirth. Deep oceans, where oxygen remained scarce for longer, took more time. The recovery was uneven, patchy, a mosaic of silence and renewal. But slowly, the patches grew together, and the oceans regained their role as the heart of the planet's life systems. Fossils record this recovery in striking ways. After the barren layers of the extinction, new species suddenly appear. Shells return in abundance, first small and simple, then larger and more complex. Fish fossils multiply, showing the rise of new lineages that would dominate future oceans. Coral-like structures re-emerge, marking the return of reef ecosystems. Predators leave behind teeth, evidence of their renewed place at the top of food chains. The fossil record becomes crowded again, not as rich as before, but filled with signs of recovery, of life pushing forward. The recovery also reshaped the trajectory of evolution. Many lineages that had dominated before were gone forever, and in their absence, new groups rose. The extinction cleared the stage, and the survivors wrote a new script. Species that might have remained minor players instead became dominant. The fish that survived became ancestors of lineages that would one day include nearly all modern fishes. The mollusks that endured diversified into the clams, snails, and cephalopods we know today. Even the microbes shaped the future, stabilizing conditions that allowed higher life to thrive. The forgotten ocean did not just erase, it redirected, shaping the future of life in new and unpredictable ways. It is remarkable to consider how life rebuilt itself from so little. From 90% loss, from ecosystems erased, from silence stretching across millions of years, the oceans returned to abundance. The resilience of life is extraordinary, but it is not invincible. The process required time, vast time and patience, measured not in centuries but in epochs. What was lost was never replaced exactly. What returned was different, new, unfamiliar. The oceans were reborn, but they were not the same oceans as before. The story of recovery is both hopeful and sobering. It shows that life can endure unimaginable catastrophe, that extinction is not the end of the story, but a turning point. Yet it also shows that recovery is slow, that the scars of collapse last longer than we can imagine. What vanished was gone forever. What returned was new, but it took tens of millions of years to build. The oceans remind us that resilience is not about instant healing, but about the long, patient persistence of life in the face of destruction. In the forgotten ocean, recovery was not a miracle, but a process. Each survivor carried the potential of the future, each adaptation a step forward. From emptiness, diversity returned. From silence, abundance arose. The seas, once almost erased, became alive again, carrying the story of life into new ages. The memory of collapse remained written in stone, but the reality of renewal lived on in every creature that swam in the reborn seas. The reconstruction of the oceans after the catastrophe is one of the greatest demonstrations of life's endurance. It shows that even at the edge of total erasure, the thread of life can hold. It also shows that while the oceans nearly died, they could recover, though only through patience measured in deep time. The forgotten ocean was not the end. It was the crucible that reshaped life, burning away the old and leaving the possibility of the new. Out of loss came rebirth, and from silence, the oceans learned to sing again. Life on Earth has always existed on the edge of a knife. The forgotten ocean, the one that almost erased everything, reminds us of this truth more starkly than almost any other chapter in history. When we look back across hundreds of millions of years, we see creatures that once thrived, oceans that seemed endless and invincible, ecosystems that appeared permanent. But permanence is an illusion. The catastrophe that silenced the seas proves that life is never guaranteed, that existence continues not because the world is safe, but because life clings stubbornly to even the smallest chance of survival. The oceans before collapse were rich and dazzling, filled with predators and prey, with builders and wanderers, with innovation written into every shell and fin. But in a moment of geological time, almost all of it was gone. The balance shifted, oxygen vanished, poisons spread, and life crumbled under pressures it could not resist. The lesson of that silence is that fragility is universal. No lineage, no matter how successful, can escape the possibility of erasure when conditions collapse. The ammonites, the trilobites, the great hunters of the deep, all vanished, not because they were weak, but because the systems that sustained them failed. Survival belonged to the few. Burrowers, filter feeders, microorganisms, creatures that had never been dominant, never been celebrated, became the custodians of life. They endured not by triumphing, but by enduring. Their modest existence carried the thread of continuity forward, proving that survival does not always favor the strong, but the adaptable. The story of the forgotten ocean is the story of how survival is sometimes measured in patience rather than power, in resilience rather than dominance. From their persistence, the oceans were eventually reborn, but they were never the same. This near erasure reshaped the trajectory of evolution. When 90% of life disappears, the future cannot simply rebuild the past. The ecosystems that returned were different, filled with new lineages that rose from the shadows of survivors. Entirely new paths were carved out because the old ones had been erased. This is one of the most sobering lessons of extinction. What vanishes does not come back. It is gone forever, and what replaces it will be different, often simpler at first, always unfamiliar. The oceans of today exist because of those survivors, but they are built on the bones of worlds that will never return. The forgotten ocean is a warning as much as it is a story. It tells us how quickly life can collapse when the invisible systems that sustain it are pushed too far. The killers were not monsters, not asteroids, not sudden strikes from space, but chemistry and heat, gases and currents. These forces were invisible, creeping, slow at first, but relentless. They are the same forces we see today. Carbon dioxide rises, oceans warm, dead zones spread, reefs bleach, fish populations decline. The parallels are uncomfortable, undeniable, and urgent. To ignore them is to ignore the very warnings written into stone by oceans that almost died once before. It is tempting to believe we are different, that our knowledge and technology will shield us. But the forgotten ocean reminds us of humility. Life is fragile, even when it appears abundant. Ecosystems are delicate, even when they appear permanent. The great collapse of the past happened without intent, without industry, without billions of people altering the climate. It was driven by natural forces alone. Today, we add to those forces with our own. If natural catastrophe could nearly erase life once, what might happen if human actions drive similar changes again? And yet, the story is not only about loss. It is also about survival. Even when 90% of life was gone, the thread held. The oceans did not die entirely. They endured, reduced to silence, but not to nothing. That endurance gave rise to the future, to new forms of beauty and diversity, to new chapters in the history of life. The resilience of life is real, but it is not invincible. It requires time, sometimes tens of millions of years, to recover. That is the scale of healing after collapse. For us, that means recovery cannot be an answer. Once silence falls, It will not be lifted in any human lifetime. The forgotten ocean is a story of extremes. It is the story of abundance collapsing into emptiness, of giants erased while the humble endured, of invisible forces reshaping the course of life itself. It is a reminder of fragility, of resilience, of loss, and of the precarious balance that sustains existence. It is also a story of perspective. To us, the oceans seem eternal, their vastness beyond comprehension. But to the earth, they are chapters in a book, each one fragile, each one subject to being rewritten by catastrophe. When we imagine that world, the silence, the emptiness, the ruins of reefs, the vanished predators, we are reminded that survival is not promised. It must be earned every moment, carried forward by those capable of enduring. Our own existence rests on the same fragile systems: oxygen in the air, carbon balanced in the atmosphere, nutrients carried by oceans. The forgotten ocean whispers across time that these balances can break, and when they do, abundance can vanish in the blink of an eye. The final lesson is that life is both fragile and stubborn. Fragile because it can be erased so quickly, so thoroughly, by forces beyond its control. Stubborn because even in silence, even in ruin, it persists. The forgotten ocean was almost the end, but it was not the end. Life endured. From emptiness came renewal. From loss came transformation. That is the paradox of extinction. It destroys, yet it also clears the path for something new. But what is new is not what was lost. The past remains gone forever. The story of the forgotten ocean should not be seen only as tragedy, but as perspective. It shows us how close life has come to vanishing, how thin the thread of existence really is, and how miraculous it is that we are here at all. It also shows us that we carry responsibility. We are the only species capable of seeing the warnings written in stone, the only ones able to recognize the signs before silence falls again. What we choose to do with that knowledge will determine whether our oceans remain vibrant or whether they echo the silence of the past. The forgotten ocean is more than a memory. It is a shadow that still lingers, a scar etched into the history of Earth. It is a reminder that abundance is not guaranteed, that life can be erased, and that survival is always precarious. But it is also a reminder that even in the darkest times, the thread can hold, and from silence, life can return. We stand at a moment where these lessons matter more than ever. To remember them is to honor the past. To ignore them is to risk repeating it. And if you want to see another video, you can click right here.